let's get into today's story. On a December afternoon in 2013, 80-year-old Peggy Nadell gazed out of her second-story bedroom window, watching the snow fall onto the ground below. Peggy's large gray wooden house sat tucked away in Valley Cottage, New York, a small upscale enclave located in Clarkstown, less than an hour northwest of New York City. Peggy had lived in this house for 50 years. She loved her small town, and she thought there was something really special about it in the winter. The snow made everything quiet, beautiful, and almost otherworldly. In her bedroom, Peggy glanced down at her watch. She felt like she could stand there for hours just staring at the snowfall, but she had someplace to be, and Peggy hated being late. So she walked out of her room and down a hallway across an old hardwood floor to the stairs. Peggy held onto the banister and slowly made her way to the first floor. At 80 years old, Peggy was still in great shape. She exercised almost every day at the nearby Jewish community center, and even when there was snow on the ground and it was freezing outside, she still enjoyed walking around town or in the public park that was close to her house. But Peggy admitted that the stairs in her house had begun to get a bit tricky for her, and her daughter, Suzanne, had become paranoid that Peggy was going to take a bad fall and hurt herself on the stairs. So Peggy, not wanting to worry her family, now made it a point to take her time when she was going up and down the stairs and to always hold on to the banister. Peggy finally reached the first floor, and she walked across the living room towards the front of the house. Peggy's house was almost like a museum, and also a time capsule. There were paintings hung on the walls, and small sculptures and other pieces of art that could be found on tables and shelves in the living room, but there was also 50 years' worth of family keepsakes, photos of her grown children at almost every age, and some recent drawings her grandkids had made for her. Peggy pulled a long coat off a coat rack by the front door, and she put it on over her black sweater. Peggy had short brown hair that she styled every day, and she wore red lipstick. Peggy had been obsessed with fashion from a young age, and that obsession had never really gone away. So she always tried to look and dress her best whenever she left the house. Peggy grabbed a leather bag that contained books, notebooks, and pens. Then she set the house alarm by pushing on a keypad by the door, and then she walked outside across the porch to her car parked in the driveway. Peggy got in, started the car, turned on the radio, and began heading towards New York City. After driving into the city and parking her car, Peggy made her way through a big throng of people walking down Fifth Ave in Manhattan. She looked at the holiday decorations and Christmas lights hanging around the street, and she had a huge smile on her face. As much as Peggy loved living in her sleepy little town, there was nothing quite like being in the big city. Over the course of her life, Peggy had traveled all over the world. She'd seen Roman ruins, the pyramids in Egypt, and she'd laid on beautiful beaches all around the globe. But New York City had always been a very special place for her. Peggy walked for a few minutes and then stepped into a white stone building that housed one of the City University of New York's campuses in the area. Inside, Peggy made her way to a small classroom where she was sitting in on a PhD-level art history class. Peggy said hello to some of the other students who had already arrived. Many of them were at least 50 years younger than she was. Peggy made it to her seat, she pulled off her coat and put it on the back of her chair, then she sat down and grabbed her notebook out of her bag. A young woman sitting nearby smiled, and Peggy smiled back. Peggy knew she must be a bit of a mystery to most of her fellow students. They must have wondered why this well-dressed old lady was in class with them. But anybody who knew Peggy even reasonably well knew that she had always prized learning and education above almost anything else. Back in the mid-1950s, Peggy had fallen in love with a man named Robert Nadell, and she had gotten married to him. And not long after they got married, Peggy gave birth to their daughter, Suzanne. Then, a couple of years later, Peggy had their son, Jim. And Peggy loved being a mother, but she didn't want to just stay at home. So she had decided to go back to school to get her MBA, a graduate business degree. Her husband, Robert, had been totally thrilled about her decision. He thought Peggy was one of the smartest people he'd ever met, and he knew how important education was to her. But at the time, most other people around Peggy had thought she was crazy for wanting to go back to school for anything, especially a master's degree in business, because at this time in the 1960s, women represented less than 1% of students at the top MBA programs in the United States. But Peggy believed it was her duty to continue learning as much as she could, and she had refused to accept that being a woman had anything to do with her ability to succeed in business school or the corporate world. And so after getting her MBA, Peggy had proven everybody who doubted her wrong. She had gone on to work for Xerox, a huge corporation that was a pioneer in photocopiers and other technology products. And after years of working at that company, Peggy had become one of Xerox's first female executives. Peggy had a long and very successful career, and when she had finally stepped away from her work, she enjoyed retirement right alongside her husband Robert. They had loved to travel, and they had spent a lot of their time helping their community by volunteering for local groups and charities. And as much as Peggy had loved her high-powered executive job, she actually enjoyed the volunteer work that she and Robert were able to do even more. But then, in 2003, Robert had died unexpectedly, and suddenly Peggy had found herself all alone in her big old house. Peggy's daughter, Suzanne, lived about 20 minutes away, and so the mother and daughter spent a lot of time together. But Peggy knew Suzanne had a life and a job that kept her busy, and Peggy didn't want to give up on all the things that made her happy just because she was on her own now. She wanted to keep learning about new things and experiencing new things. So Peggy had begun to study art history, a subject she'd always been interested in. And eventually she decided she wanted to learn as much as she possibly could about art history. So at 80 years old, Peggy began sitting in on these PhD-level art history classes. Not to get another degree, but just because she really loved it and wanted to learn more. Peggy listened closely and took extensive notes during the professor's lecture. And as Peggy wrote in her notebook, she almost felt like a kid again. She knew how absurd that would sound to the others in the class. After all, she was a mother and a grandmother, and she had lived a full life by this point. But Peggy felt like learning new things was really the best way to stay active and engaged in the world around her. Later that night, Peggy was in her bedroom, still thinking about what she learned that day in class, as she changed out of her clothes into her nightgown. Then, once she was changed, she sat down on her bed and she grabbed the home phone off the bedside table. Now, there were two people Peggy usually talked to multiple times a day: her daughter, Suzanne, and her daughter-in-law, Diana. Peggy knew both women liked to check on her a lot to make sure she was okay. Suzanne was paranoid about Peggy falling down the stairs, and Diana, who was married to Peggy's son and lived in Florida, worried about Peggy going out and driving when it was cold and snowing. Peggy regularly reminded her daughter and daughter-in-law that she was more than capable of taking care of herself, but she did love talking to them both and staying in touch. So Peggy called her daughter, Suzanne, and told her all about the day's art history class. Then, after she was done speaking to Suzanne, Peggy called Diana in Florida. Now, Peggy's son was not much for phone calls, so his wife, Diana, was really Peggy's only real connection to her grandkids who lived so far away. Peggy told Diana that she really missed everybody and that she was hoping she could pay for Diana and her son's 2 kids to come visit her in New York that summer. When Diana heard that, she got really excited and said the kids would love that. Eventually, the 2 women wrapped up the call and said goodnight, and then Peggy hung up the phone and walked over to the bedroom window. It was still snowing outside, and the snowflakes seemed to glow under the streetlights. Peggy was still struck by how beautiful the winter scene always looked, but now that she knew her grandkids were very likely coming to visit her, she could not wait for summer to arrive. Over a month later, on January 24, 2014, Peggy was in her room getting ready for bed again. Peggy had kept busy over the recent holiday season. She'd spent the first night of Hanukkah with her daughter Suzanne, and she had also talked to her daughter-in-law Diana and her grandkids in Florida almost every day. She'd gone to various holiday parties in town with close friends, and she continued to exercise at the Jewish Community Center. But despite how fun the holiday season had been, it still totally wore Peggy out, and she was still feeling tired weeks later. So she was hoping to sleep in late the following morning and get caught up on some much-needed rest. It hadn't snowed in weeks, but temperatures had dropped to a freezing 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was cold and drafty inside of Peggy's old house. So she climbed into bed and pulled a whole pile of warm blankets over her. Then she turned off the lamp on her bedside table and eventually drifted off to sleep. But just a few hours later, at 1:17 a.m., so this is now on January 25th, Peggy woke up startled. Her home phone was ringing on the bedside table right next to her, and the sound had pulled her out of her dream. She took a breath and got her bearings, and then leaned over and flipped the switch on the lamp. Peggy looked at the clock next to the phone and saw how late it was, and she started to panic because she was worried that a phone call at this hour could only mean something bad had happened. Peggy sat up in bed and cautiously answered the phone, and then after talking to the caller for about a minute, Peggy relaxed. Now, Peggy was still a bit shocked from getting a call in the middle of the night that woke her up, but there was no emergency or any bad news. Peggy just had a couple of unexpected late-night visitors standing outside of her house. So Peggy got out of her bed, she walked to her closet and put on her robe and slippers. Then she headed downstairs and walked to the front door. She opened the door and smiled at the two people standing outside. But before she could let her visitors in, a loud, very high-pitched beeping sound began echoing through Peggy's house. Peggy had forgotten to turn off the house alarm before she opened the door. Peggy quickly punched in the code on the keypad right near the door, and it turned the alarm off, but the phone in the kitchen started ringing, so Peggy rushed to go grab it. The alarm company was calling to see if everything was okay, and Peggy would give them a password to let them know it really was her, and then she told them everything was fine. Then she hung up the phone and called out to her visitors to come inside. And they did. They joined Peggy in the kitchen, and she poured each of them a glass of water. Then the three of them sat at the kitchen table and talked for a few minutes, and then Peggy stood up and excused herself. Peggy walked through the living room and went up the stairs to the second-floor bathroom, which was a lot warmer than the one on the first floor. But when Peggy was done and about to leave the bathroom, she heard shouting outside and footsteps on the stairs. And so Peggy stepped out of the bathroom, and she was surprised to see her two visitors were standing right there outside. They were quiet and kind of awkward, and Peggy thought maybe the two of them were in the middle of some kind of argument that she had now just kind of butted herself into. But Peggy smiled at them and said, "Let's go down to the kitchen and keep on talking." Then Peggy walked past them, put her hand on the banister, and began walking down the steps. And the two visitors followed her. But before reaching the bottom of the stairs, Peggy heard one of her visitors begin to scream right behind her. Several hours later, at 9 a.m. on January 25th, so almost 8 hours after the visitors had arrived at Peggy's house, Peggy's daughter, Suzanne, stepped out of her car in front of Peggy's house. Suzanne was 55 years old with frizzy dyed blonde hair. She wore jeans, tennis shoes, a t-shirt, and a big winter coat. Suzanne had not inherited her mother's love of fashion. Instead, Suzanne preferred comfort over style. Suzanne walked quickly to the front door. It was bitterly cold out, but Suzanne barely noticed. She had woken up that morning and called her mother like she did almost every day, but Peggy hadn't answered. There was a chance Peggy could have just slept in or gone out to exercise, but Suzanne had tried calling back a little bit later, and Peggy still didn't answer. So Suzanne had called her sister-in-law, Diana, because she knew Diana usually called Peggy several times a day too, and Diana said she had called Peggy too at around 7:30 that morning, but Peggy didn't pick up, and so Diana said she left a message but still had not heard back yet. After talking to Diana, Suzanne was worried enough that she decided to just drive over to her mother's house to make sure everything was okay. Once Suzanne reached her mother's porch, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the key she had to her mother's house. She used it to open up the door, and then once she was inside, she called out for her mother, but there was no answer. So Suzanne began walking around the first floor of the house, and when Suzanne walked into the living room, she let out a blood-curdling scream. Suzanne saw Peggy's crumpled body on the floor at the bottom of the stairs. Suzanne instinctively ran to her mother, and when she got a good look at her, she saw there was a knife sticking out of Peggy's chest. And so Suzanne dropped down and just yanked the knife out and threw it on the floor, and then she leaned in and touched her mother's face, and she could feel that Peggy's skin had gone totally ice cold. Totally distraught, Suzanne took out her cell phone and dialed 911. When the emergency dispatcher answered, Suzanne began yelling that she needed help and that her mother must have fallen down the stairs while holding a knife and she accidentally stabbed herself. Not long after the 911 call, Detectives Stephen Cole Hatchard and Earl Lawrence of the Clarkstown Police Department pulled up in a sedan outside of Peggy's house and stepped out of the car. The snow had started again, and they could feel the cold biting into their hands and faces. Local police had already run crime scene tape all across the front of Peggy's house, and some of Peggy's neighbors had already begun to gather nearby. Hatchard and Lawrence also saw Peggy's daughter, Suzanne, pacing back and forth in the driveway, a few feet in front of a uniformed police officer. Suzanne was mumbling to herself, and she looked totally dazed. The detectives approached Suzanne and introduced themselves, and Suzanne immediately repeated what she had said to the 911 operator. Her mother must have fallen down the stairs while she was holding a knife and accidentally stabbed herself. Suzanne said she had been worried about her mother on those stairs for a long time. But before the detectives could even really process what Suzanne was talking about, she would say something that sent up multiple red flags. Suzanne told Hatchard and Lawrence that police would likely find her fingerprints on the knife because she had pulled the knife out of her mother's chest before trying to administer CPR on her mother. And Suzanne said her fingerprints were all over the house because she went to visit her mom there all the time. But Suzanne didn't stop there. She just kept on talking. And she would tell the detectives that her mom was really rich, but she said this was not how she wanted to inherit her cut of her mom's estate. Detective Hatchard told Suzanne to wait with the officer outside and that they would talk to her once they had searched the house. Then Hatchard and Lawrence walked towards the front door while Suzanne began pacing in the driveway again. The detectives couldn't believe what they had just learned. They hadn't even stepped inside the house yet, but already Peggy's daughter had admitted to tampering with evidence by pulling the knife out of her mother's chest. Suzanne had also tried to cover for the fact that her fingerprints would be found on a potential weapon and throughout the house. And she had given a clear motive for possibly having killed her mother by talking about Peggy's money. That said, Hatchard and Lawrence knew that people under stress could act in strange ways, especially when dealing with the death of a loved one. But neither of them had ever encountered anything like what had just happened with Suzanne. It sort of seemed like she had worked up a big cover story and then blurted all of it out as soon as cops showed up. Inside the house, detectives Hatchard and Lawrence found a small group of forensics officers searching for fingerprints, blood samples, and other physical evidence. When the local police had first arrived on the scene, they really weren't sure what they were dealing with, or if Suzanne's story about her mom falling with the knife was true, so a forensics team and the detectives had been called in. But when Hatchard and Lawrence reached the bottom of Peggy's stairs, they didn't need forensics officers to tell them that Suzanne's version of what happened was totally off. On the ground in front of the detectives was Peggy Nadell. She was dead and lying face up on the floor. The detectives crouched down and right away saw multiple knife wounds in Peggy's chest, and they saw the knife that Suzanne said she had removed lying on the floor nearby. And when detectives looked more closely at Peggy's body, they began to notice wounds on the side of her head as though she had been struck with a blunt object several times. And right near Peggy's face was this small sculpture, which was the bust of someone's head, and then near Peggy's hand was a gold metal ball, another piece of art. And so maybe those two things were the blunt object that had been smashed into Peggy. Also, the detectives saw bruising around Peggy's neck and throat, which most likely indicated that Peggy had been strangled at some point. In short, there was no way Peggy had just tumbled down the stairs while holding a knife, and that was how she accidentally killed herself. Clearly, this was a murder. Hatchard and Lawrence were appalled by what they saw. Any violent crime was bad enough, but neither of them could understand what type of person would attack a defenseless 80-year-old woman. The detectives assumed Peggy must have been struck in the head with either the small sculpture or that golden ball that were laying close by her body, but forensics officers said no fingerprints or physical evidence had been found on either of those objects. It was like they had both been wiped clean. So the detectives stepped away from Peggy's body and walked upstairs and went to search Peggy's bedroom. In the bedroom, they saw a few dresser drawers were laid out on the floor, and there was an open jewelry box on top of the dresser. Someone had clearly rifled through the jewelry box, but it was still filled with several expensive pieces. Hatchard and Lawrence looked around the rest of the room, and when they were done with their cursory check, they both had the same thought. This was not a robbery. If anything, this was a weak attempt by Peggy's killer to make it look like a robbery. By 1 p.m., so about 4 hours after Suzanne made that 911 call, Hatchard and Lawrence had finished their initial search of the crime scene and had briefed their boss on what they had found. They weren't sure exactly what had happened in the house, but they knew there was only one place to start their investigation, and that was with Peggy's daughter, Suzanne. Later that afternoon, Hatchard and Lawrence sat in a comfortable police station conference room across a long table from Suzanne. They wanted Suzanne to be able to talk freely and feel comfortable, which is why they had not brought her into a cramped interrogation room. The detectives had not found any direct evidence to pin Peggy's murder on Suzanne, but they had heard Suzanne's bizarre statements she made at the house, and they felt like that was definitely enough to go on. Detective Hatchard started by asking Suzanne to explain why she had been at Peggy's house in the first place. Suzanne talked about not being able to get a hold of her mom and how her sister-in-law Diana had had the same issue, so Suzanne had gone by her mother's house to check on Peggy. After all, Peggy was 80 years old, she lived alone, so Suzanne checked on her a lot. That made total sense to Hatchard and Lawrence, but then Hatchard asked Suzanne why she had been so preoccupied with her fingerprints potentially being found on the knife. And Suzanne's answer to this seemed even weirder than some of the stuff she'd said at the house. Suzanne leaned across the table and told them she watched a lot of TV shows and news programs about murder, so she knew the cops would very likely be looking at Peggy's family members as suspects, and so she wanted to clear herself. Hatchard and Lawrence could tell Suzanne really believed saying this was actually going to help her, but they thought this made her look even more guilty. Here was a person who watched TV shows that demonstrated how law enforcement tracked down killers, and then she had taken steps like tampering with a murder weapon that could throw investigators off her trail. The detectives ended up questioning Suzanne for several hours that afternoon, and at the end of it, as far as the detectives were concerned, Suzanne had done nothing to clear herself of her mother's murder. During the interview, Suzanne seemed kind of erratic, and she kept bringing up her inheritance. She said her mom was worth about $4 million, and now that she was dead, Suzanne would get half of it. By the end of the interview, several police officers who were watching the interview thought Hatchard and Lawrence had gotten enough damning statements from Suzanne to actually put her in custody. But the detectives knew that if they did that, word would very quickly spread all across the area that Suzanne had been arrested for murdering her mother. And once that rumor was out there, people would have a really hard time ever changing their minds about what they thought Suzanne had done, even if it was proven later on that Suzanne was actually innocent. So Hatchard and Lawrence talked over their various options, and ultimately they just didn't feel like they had enough evidence yet to justify holding Suzanne and potentially destroying her reputation. So they let her go. But as soon as Suzanne was out of the police station, Hatchard and Lawrence called a judge and they got a warrant to conduct full-time surveillance on Suzanne. Police would get stationed outside of Suzanne's home and her work, and they would watch her at those two locations and follow her anytime she left them. In the following days, along with conducting their around-the-clock surveillance, investigators began digging into Suzanne's recent credit card history, and they found another huge red flag. On the night of January 24th, so just hours before Suzanne's mother would be killed, Suzanne had gone shopping at a grocery store that was close to Peggy's house. But based on her credit card records, this was not where Suzanne typically did her shopping. She went to a store that was much closer to her own home. But it was not just this grocery store's location that seemed kind of suspicious. On the night in question, investigators learned that Suzanne purchased rubber gloves and cleaning supplies. Hatchard and Lawrence felt like this was just one more thing that pointed towards Suzanne's guilt. After all, rubber gloves and cleaning supplies could explain why there were no fingerprints found at the crime scene. And so the detectives were confident they were on the right track, and they thought if Suzanne had killed her mother, she would slip up soon, and they would be there to arrest her. At 11 a.m. on January 29, 2014, 4 days after Peggy's murder, Suzanne sat in a wooden pew in a funeral home next to her husband. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her whole body felt like it was trembling. The pews around her were filled with Peggy's friends, family, and members of the Valley Cottage community who Peggy had gone out of her way to help. Even though police had not arrested Suzanne, word had already spread that she was a primary suspect. And a couple of days earlier, when Suzanne had gone to her mother's house to pick out clothes for her mother to be buried in, a neighbor had stepped outside. And this woman, who had known Suzanne since she was just a little girl, began screaming, "When are you going to arrest her?" And so the rumors and the pressure were really starting to get to Suzanne, and it was making it hard to sleep at night. Towards the end of the service, Suzanne and others recited a prayer in Hebrew, and then Suzanne quickly made her way out of the funeral home. Once outside, Suzanne welcomed the fresh, cold air. It was like she could breathe again. Inside, she'd felt stifled because she felt like everybody was staring at her and talking about her. A minute later, Suzanne's younger brother Jim and his wife Diana came outside and walked over to her. They had flown in from Florida shortly after they learned about Peggy's death, and Suzanne could not have been happier they were here. Suzanne said hello to her brother, who she always thought was kind of strange, and then she hugged Diana, who she was very close with, and they talked for a while about how much Peggy had meant to them. But as they stood there chatting, they had no idea the police were watching. Not long after Peggy's funeral, Detectives Hatchard and Lawrence met with Suzanne's brother, Jim, and his wife, Diana, at the police station. The detectives asked them basic questions, like where they had been on the night before the murder. Jim had been at his house in Florida, and Diana had been at a wedding most of the day. Diana would say that she had called Peggy on the morning of the murder, but didn't get an answer. And then she also said she'd spoken to Suzanne right before Suzanne had gone to Peggy's house and discovered Peggy's body. Hatchard and Lawrence would, of course, follow up on Jim and Diana's statements, but the detectives really wanted information on Suzanne. They wanted to know if Suzanne had spoken to Jim and Diana about the inheritance money that Suzanne seemed so eager to tell police about. But Diana said the idea that Suzanne had anything to do with this murder was ridiculous. She said Suzanne loved her mom, and she was closer to Peggy than basically anybody else in the world. And so Diana said the police really needed to stop wasting their time looking at Suzanne and bring the person who actually killed Peggy to justice. But when Jim and Diana left the police station after their interview, the detectives still totally believed Suzanne was their most likely suspect. Family members sticking up for each other was not anything new. But over the next few weeks, surveillance on Suzanne did not get Hatchard and Lawrence any closer to having concrete evidence that she was in fact the killer. Still, Hatchard and Lawrence hoped that even if Suzanne's actions didn't lead them anywhere, that maybe her phone records soon would. Investigator Robin Arias sat at her desk staring at hundreds of numbers printed on a piece of paper. Most people's eyes would probably have glazed over, staring at all those numbers for as long as Arias had, but she could feel her pulse racing as she scanned the sheet of paper over and over. Arias was an investigator with the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, and she was an expert at analyzing phone data. Arias had begun working with Detectives Hatchard and Lawrence on Peggy's murder case, and currently she was studying calls that Suzanne made, and she was also looking at Peggy's phone records. Arias confirmed that Suzanne called Peggy multiple times before calling 911 on the morning of the murder. Arias also confirmed that Diana had also called Peggy and had spoken to Suzanne on that same morning. But now there was something on one of the sheets of paper, something from Peggy's phone records, that really leapt out at Arias. She could see that someone had called Peggy at exactly 1:17 a.m. on the morning of the murder. And this was a big deal because that time was basically right before Peggy was killed. But there was something else that struck Arias as odd about this call. The call had come from a number that didn't show up anywhere else in Peggy's phone records. Arias was checking the records to make sure she was right, but she was convinced that that late-night call was made by someone that Peggy did not normally speak to. And so finally, after scanning the pages several more times, Arias was sure she was right about that phone number, that it was really unique. So she grabbed her own phone and she made a few calls. Detective Hatchard was at his desk going over notes from Peggy's murder case when Arias called him. And as soon as Hatchard answered, he could tell Arias had big news. She was known to be very calm, cool, and collected basically all the time, but immediately Hatchard could hear the excitement in Arias's voice. Arias told Hatchard about the strange number that had popped up in Peggy's phone records just before her murder. But Arias said this was just the tip of the iceberg. She looked into that number and learned that it came from a phone that was not actually registered to anyone. It was something called a burner phone. A burner phone is typically a cheap cell phone that's purchased just for temporary use or to keep the user's identity anonymous. Hatchard listened to Arias, and he felt like she had just helped the investigation take a huge step forward. But then, Arias gave him the most important piece of information of all. Arias had worked for hours and hours and pulled some strings, and she had figured out where this burner phone had been purchased from and who had bought it. Hatchard thanked Arias profusely for all her help, then he hung up the phone and rushed over to Lawrence's desk to tell him what he just learned. It would take the detectives a while to follow up on all the information Arias had provided them, but once they had gone through all of it, they would figure out who killed Peggy. Based on Robin Arias' phone data analysis, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe occurred in the early morning hours of January 25, 2014, when someone murdered Peggy Nadell in the home she had lived in for 50 years. On that day, just after 1 a.m., the killers, plural, drove through the town center of Valley Cottage. And there was something about the place that almost didn't seem real, like it was a movie set version of a perfect small town. The killers looked at each other, but didn't speak. They knew what they were about to do would leave this entire community in complete shock. A few minutes later, the driver pulled onto Peggy's street and then parked in front of Peggy's large gray house. A few porch lights were on at some of the nearby houses, but overall, the neighborhood was totally quiet. In the car, the passenger reached into their pocket, took out a phone, and called Peggy's home phone number. This was the call that came through at 1:17 a.m. The passenger's voice was bright and cheery when Peggy picked up on the other line. The passenger said they were so sorry to call late, but they had been in the neighborhood and they really needed to come in and talk to Peggy face-to-face about something. Peggy seemed frazzled, but she said to give her a few minutes to pull herself together and she'd come downstairs and let them in. The passenger hung up and then handed the phone to the driver, who slipped it into their pocket. Then the passenger reached down into a bag that was on the floorboard and pulled out 2 pairs of gloves and handed one of the pairs to the driver. Both killers put the gloves into their coat pockets. Then the driver reached into the back seat and grabbed a small leather bag that had a strap on it, and the driver slung that bag over their shoulder. The killers then looked at each other and then stepped out of the car into the frigid winter air and began walking across the yard towards Peggy's front door. As soon as they reached the front door, Peggy opened it up with a big smile on her face. But before the killers could step inside, Peggy's alarm system went off and the phone in the kitchen began to ring. The killers waited while Peggy dealt with the alarm company, and then they walked into the house and joined Peggy in the kitchen. The killers sat down at the table and Peggy brought them some water. They all sat and talked for a few minutes before Peggy said she had to go use the bathroom and headed upstairs. While Peggy was upstairs, one of the killers, the passenger in the car, said it was time to act, and that the driver needed to be the one to actually do the job on their own. But the driver said no, they both needed to do it to make sure Peggy didn't fight back. But the passenger just barked back that, come on, Peggy's an old woman, it won't take 2 people, and pretty soon the 2 killers were basically shouting at each other. But quickly they stopped because they did know they did need to act soon, and ultimately they agreed they would do it together. So the killers slipped on their gloves, and the driver took the leather strap off of their bag, and then the killers ran out of the kitchen, through the living room, and up the stairs. But when Peggy walked out of the bathroom and saw them, the killers just kind of froze there, staring up at her awkwardly. Peggy smiled at them and didn't really know what to make of this, so she walked past them and just began walking down the stairs, and the killers followed her. But as they were going down the stairs, the killers knew that if they were going to do it, they needed to do it right now. So the driver just suddenly screamed and rushed Peggy from behind and wrapped that leather strap from the bag around Peggy's throat. Peggy and the driver stumbled down the stairs and hit the floor on the first floor, and the driver just kept pulling that leather strap tighter and tighter, strangling Peggy, but Peggy was somehow managing to put up a pretty good fight. The driver began to yell in frustration that this woman won't die, so the passenger ran into the living room and grabbed 2 pieces of art, a small bust of a person and a gold medal ball. And the passenger ran back to the stairs with these objects in their hands. When the driver saw the passenger carrying these weapons, the driver let go of their stranglehold on Peggy and kind of backed away. And then the passenger kind of looked at the 2 objects in their hands and dropped the lighter gold ball onto the floor, opting to use the bust instead. Then the passenger got down on their knees, held up the small statue, and began slamming it over and over again into the side of Peggy's head. Blood spilled from the wound, and Peggy flopped over onto her back. Eventually, the passenger dropped the statue on the floor and backed away. And as the killers stood there staring at their victim, they began to hear breathing still rattling from Peggy's chest. So, without hesitation, the passenger ran to the kitchen, threw open a drawer, and grabbed a large kitchen knife. Seconds later, the passenger ran back to the base of the stairs. They got down on top of Peggy and just began stabbing her over and over and over again in the chest until Peggy stopped breathing, went limp, and died. The passenger just left the knife plunged into Peggy's chest, and then the passenger stood up, and the two killers ran back to the kitchen where they grabbed their cleaning supplies, and they wiped down their water glasses, and then they ran back over to the foot of the stairs, and they cleaned off the statue that had been used to bludgeon Peggy. They also wiped down the knife handle and the gold medal ball. Then the killers went upstairs to Peggy's room, and there they put a couple of dresser drawers out on the floor and took a few pieces of jewelry from a jewelry box in an attempt to make it look like Peggy's murder had just been the result of a robbery. Satisfied with their work, the killers walked downstairs, stepped over Peggy's body, went outside, and got back into their car. The passenger then told the driver to dispose of that burner phone and also dispose of the leather strap they had used to strangle Peggy. The driver said they would, and then the pair drove off. Several hours later, the passenger killer was heading to an airport in Washington, D.C. when their phone rang. It was their sister-in-law calling. The passenger answered the phone and then told their sister-in-law that they too had called Peggy earlier that morning, but Peggy hadn't answered and they had no idea why. It would turn out Suzanne had nothing to do with her mother's murder. But Suzanne's sister-in-law, so Peggy's own daughter-in-law, Diana, did murder Peggy. Suzanne's strange behavior following her mother's murder had most likely been a combination of grief and shock, and the fact that Suzanne had bought rubber gloves and cleaning supplies just hours before the murder was nothing more than a truly unfortunate coincidence. But it turned out that Suzanne was not the only person in the family who had spent time thinking about the millions of dollars in inheritance money that would come their way if Peggy died. Diana had thought about that money a lot, and she knew that her family would get $2 million, so half of Peggy's wealth, when Peggy was dead. But there was a catch. Diana had discovered that Peggy stipulated in her will that Diana would get nothing if she and Jim, so Peggy's son, got divorced. And Diana had badly wanted to divorce Jim. But when Diana had learned about Peggy's will and that stipulation, she realized she had to make sure Jim got a share of Peggy's money before she left Jim. Then, once Jim had his millions, Diana could get her cut through a divorce settlement. So Diana had spent weeks putting together her plan to have Peggy murdered. And then she had paid someone to come on as a partner to help her set everything up. The plan Diana conceived was purposefully convoluted because she thought that would throw police off of her scent. But the phone records, and specifically her use of the burner phone, had allowed investigators to totally unravel Diana's plan. Phone data analyst Robin Arias had discovered the use of the burner phone and had tracked its purchase to a shop in Florida just minutes away from where Diana lived. It turned out Diana had not been the one who actually physically bought the phone, but using surveillance footage, investigators were able to track down the woman who had bought the phone. And when police questioned that woman, she said Diana had paid her money to buy the burner and hand it over. And so with the burner in her possession, Diana had told her family, and later had told police, that she flew to Washington, D.C. for a wedding. But in reality, Diana had flown to D.C. to meet a woman who had been recruited by Diana's partner to actually carry out the murder for $10,000. That woman met Diana at the airport in D.C., and they both drove several hours to New York to kill Peggy. Police believe Diana really wanted this woman to kill Peggy on her own, while Diana just supervised. That way she wouldn't have to actually murder her mother-in-law, who she had been close with for years. But in the heat of the moment, when the hired killer, or the driver, failed to strangle Peggy to death, Diana, who had been the passenger in the car, had acted on instinct and bludgeoned Peggy and then stabbed her to death. Diana believed that involving other people to set up and carry out this murder would help distance herself from the crime and maybe keep her out of trouble. But as investigators put together all the puzzle pieces, everybody else involved in this crime pointed the finger directly at Diana. The woman who was hired to kill Peggy for money and who tried unsuccessfully to strangle Peggy to death cut a plea deal, and was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. And while she was awaiting her murder trial in prison, Diana was recorded making phone calls trying to arrange the murders of 2 witnesses who could testify against her. Diana was found guilty of plotting to murder those witnesses, and as a result was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Then she was also found guilty of second-degree murder in Peggy's case and received an additional sentence of 23 years to life in prison. Peggy is buried outside of the small, quaint town where she spent 50 years of her life. With all of the things that Peggy accomplished in her career and her education, there was still just one thing that mattered to her above everything else: her own family. And so Peggy's headstone is very simple. It just says wife, mother, grandmother. At around 9:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve 1992, 18-year-old Danita Gillette finished up her shift at Rally's, a fast food hamburger restaurant in her hometown of Dayton, Ohio. She hung up her apron, she said goodbye to her coworkers, and then she stepped outside into the freezing 19-degree night air. Danita had not driven a car to work that day, so she pulled her plaid flannel jacket tightly around her to keep warm, and then she began to briskly walk in the direction of her mother's house, which was only a couple of miles away. That night, like every other Christmas Eve night, Danita's family had all gathered up at her mother's house to celebrate. The Gillettes were one of those big families that were very close and who always looked out for each other. When Danita had gotten pregnant when she was only 15 years old, she had told her parents and 7 siblings, all of whom were older than her, that she'd likely have to drop out of school and get a full-time job to provide for this child. But her family's reaction was, "Nonsense. We'll help you raise this baby so you can stay in school and get a good job and still have a great life." And sure enough, from the moment Danita gave birth to her daughter, her entire family stepped up and made themselves available to provide childcare anytime she needed them to. Fast forward a couple of years back to that Christmas Eve night in 1992, and since Danita had to work that shift at Rally's, her daughter, who was now 2 years old, had been spending the night with her family at her mother's house. And so as Danita walked, she suddenly had this urge to call her family and just check in to make sure her daughter was okay, and also just to give them a heads up that she would be there in the next 30 minutes or so. So at around 10 p.m., she stopped at a payphone on the side of the road that was only about a half mile from the Rally's restaurant. She fished some coins out of her pocket, she put them into the slot on the phone, and then she dialed her mother's phone number. As the phone rang, Danita likely was thinking about how much fun it was going to be to see everyone that night. She also likely was looking forward to eating some of her mother's famous chili and cornbread that she always made around this time of the year. At Danita's mother's house, her whole family was sitting around in the living room chatting and having a nice time, just waiting for Danita to arrive. At 10 p.m., when the phone rang in the house, immediately everyone in Danita's family assumed it had to be Danita calling to let them know that she was off work and that she would be home soon. So when the phone was ringing, one of Danita's siblings, Rhonda, she jumped up and she excitedly ran into the kitchen and she pulled the phone off the receiver and she said, "Hello?" expecting to hear her sister's very happy voice on the other end of the line, but instead she heard silence. Rhonda said, "Hello?" a few more times, but when she was still met with silence, she shrugged and put the receiver back into its cradle, and then she walked back into the living room and she told her family that no, it was not Danita, it must have been a wrong number. Danita's family would stay up for a little while longer waiting for Danita, but she never showed up, and they never actually spoke to her on the phone. Eventually, the family was so tired they decided to just go to bed for the night. They figured Danita must have gotten hung up at work, which was prone to happen, and so they would just have to wait until the next morning to celebrate the holidays with her. Around the time Danita stepped outside of the Rally's restaurant and began making her walk to her mother's house, Dayton, Ohio homicide detective Doyle Burke was finishing Christmas Eve dinner at his grandmother's house in the suburbs with his wife and their 2 young children. Like the Gillettes, the Burkes also liked to get together with family on Christmas Eve at Grandma's. But much as Detective Burke enjoyed the holidays, he'd been a homicide cop long enough to know that just about every week, at least one person got murdered in Dayton. And so chances were good at some point over the next couple of days, he'd be called into work. And sure enough, that Christmas Eve night, after they were done eating, his pager went off, and he looked at the incoming code and it said, "Call work immediately." When he looked up from his pager, he noticed his wife was staring at him. She knew the drill. She knew he would have to leave. When Detective Burke stepped away to call into work, he was told there had been a shooting on Neal Avenue. The victim had been found near a payphone located about a half-mile away from the Rally's restaurant. Detective Burke said goodbye to his family, he hopped in his car, and he headed over to Neal Avenue. When he got there, he saw a ring of police cars and medical personnel all standing in a circle around this payphone. Burke parked his car on a side street and then he walked over. And when he pushed past the ring of people, he saw the victim on the sidewalk right underneath the payphone. It was a young woman lying in a pool of her own frozen blood. It was Donita Gillette. She had been shot 5 times at point-blank range, bullets striking her in the chest, the legs, and the hands. The pattern of wounds on her body suggested she'd tried to shield herself from the bullets, holding up her hands and turning her head away and crouching back like she was trying not to get hit. After she was lying on the ground, either dying or dead, whoever had attacked her ripped her plaid coat off, they took her sneakers off, and they took her backpack that contained only 50 cents. Scattered around her body were .25 caliber aluminum shell casings, which immediately stood out to Burke. That type of ammunition was distinctive. It was generally only used for target shooting because it was not a very powerful ammunition. However, obviously, it was still lethal at close range. Witnesses in the area said they had heard the shots ring out and then saw 2 young men carrying pistols running away from the payphone. Shortly after Donita's family had decided to just go to bed and see Donita in the morning, they heard a knock on the front door. It was Detective Burke telling them that their Donita had been murdered. They were beyond devastated. They couldn't understand why anyone would ever want to harm Donita. She was such a happy person who everyone seemed to love. They just couldn't understand who would do this. When Burke told the family that Donita had been killed near a payphone, and according to witnesses, her murder likely happened sometime around 10 p.m., as soon as the family heard this, they all thought of that strange, silent phone call that Rhonda had answered around 10 p.m. that night. Had that actually been Donita? Had that been her killer? They didn't know, but it just seemed like too much of a coincidence that they would get a call at the same time that she was killed. After leaving the Gillette's household and filing his report on Donita's murder, Detective Burke arrived back at his home just hours before dawn on December 25th. After catching a quick nap, he spent that morning with his family celebrating Christmas, but his heart just wasn't in it. He had been investigating homicides for years, and so over time he had become somewhat desensitized to all of the violence. However, that morning he just kept thinking of Donita Gillette's grief-stricken family when he had told them the news. He also kept thinking about Donita herself, how scared she must have been when she was crouched down trying to shield herself from her attacker. Her family had shown Burke a picture of Donita when she was alive, and she looked like such a vibrant, happy young woman with this big, infectious smile. It just didn't make any sense that someone would kill her over some shoes and a jacket and a backpack with 50 cents in it. Was this actually a personal attack where they knew who Donita was and they were targeting her, and then afterwards they kind of set it up to look like a robbery? Or was this really a robbery? In which case, again, why are you killing someone over things that are worth so little? Burke kept finding himself thinking in circles about her case. He felt like there had to be more to this than met the eye. And he would be right. That night, just before 9 p.m. on Christmas Day, Burke's pager went off again. There had been another murder. This one had taken place in the northern part of Dayton, roughly 2.5 miles from where Donita had been found. The victim was 19-year-old Richmond Maddox. He was found slumped in the driver's seat of a blue Chevy Caprice that had crashed into a tree on the side of the road. But the crash hadn't killed him. What had killed him was a gunshot wound to the right side of his head, fired from point-blank range. And they searched the car. There was no weapon inside of the car, so this was not a suicide. And they checked the exterior of the car, and there was no entry point into the car from a bullet, which means the gun that shot him had been fired from inside the car. Likely, whoever was sitting in the passenger seat or in the back seat had shot this guy in the head. And considering the car had crashed into a tree, indicates that whoever did this, whoever pulled the trigger, had done it while Richmond was actively driving the car. And so in Burke's mind, this indicated that the person who did this had been forced to do this, because it's extremely dangerous to shoot the driver of the vehicle when the car is still moving, because you're going to crash. And so this person who shot Richmond must have been desperate. Maybe they had been kidnapped by Richmond and they were forced to do this. Burke didn't know, but that seemed like the most logical theory. When police spoke to witnesses in the area, they told the police that they heard the crash and then they looked outside and they saw what looked like a short young woman, probably a teenager, get up from the ground near the car and then start running away with a limp. Even though no shell casings were found in or around Richmond's car that could, in theory, link his murder to Danita's murder, Burke still had a hunch that these two murders had to be connected. They had occurred less than 24 hours apart, so back to back, and the bodies were found less than a couple miles apart. And in Burke's experience working in homicide, coincidences rarely occurred. Things happened for a reason. And in Burke's mind, he's thinking, these murders are connected. I just got to figure out what the connection is. But Detective Burke's investigation into Richmond Maddox's death only seemed to further complicate things. Richmond's family, who were stunned at the news of his murder, had no idea who would want to kill him, or who the girl fleeing the scene could possibly be. The only girl in Richmond's life that the family could think of that might have been in the car with him was his ex-girlfriend, 16-year-old Laura Taylor, who they described as being very sweet and polite. But when Burke went to Laura Taylor's house on the morning of December 26th to interview Laura, he was in for a shock. Laura had apparently not been home in several days, and her parents were very worried. Hearing that their daughter's ex-boyfriend had been killed, they feared the worst, that something terrible had also happened to Laura. But before Detective Burke could even begin to process this new information, that now, in addition to two strange murders, he also now had a missing juvenile, who very well could be the key to solving what was happening, unbelievably, while he's thinking about all these different things, Burke felt his pager vibrate again. There had been another shooting. This time inside of a mini-market convenience store that was only 3.5 miles south of where Richmond Maddox had been found. This time, there were two victims. Both were still alive, but they were in critical condition. 38-year-old Sarah Abraham was a classic American success story. After immigrating to the United States from war-torn Ethiopia, she and her family worked hard and established businesses in the Dayton area that included a restaurant and a few convenience stores. The convenience store where this shooting took place was the location where Sarah spent the majority of her time. On the day after Christmas, while Detective Burke was speaking to Laura Taylor's family, Sarah Abraham said goodbye to her 3 young children and then headed out the door to go open the convenience store for the day. Once she arrived and she opened the store and went inside, a 71-year-old regular named Jimmy Thompson came in and he stood by the register to chat with her about the holidays. And then at some point, a middle-aged man named Jones Pettis came inside as well, and he began browsing down one of the aisles. A few minutes later, a teenage girl came up to the register and tried to buy a pack of gum, but she was 5 cents short. Jimmy cheerfully reached into his pocket and gave her a nickel. She smiled, took the nickel, put it on the counter, and then she took the gum and walked out of the store. Then, a few minutes after the girl had left, 2 young men entered the store, each holding a pistol. Sarah and Jimmy immediately threw their hands up over their head, and Sarah told the gunman, take anything you want. We'll give you all the money we have. Please just don't shoot us. One of the men barked at her to open the cash register and give them all of her money. And so with shaking hands, Sarah reached down and she opened the register. She pulled all the money out. She gave it to them, and then she kept her hands up. She had given them everything they had wanted. But for some reason, the man who had taken the money from her still raised his pistol up. He put it right in her face and he fired 2 shots. One went straight through her mouth and the other went through the top of her head. And then, after she collapsed to the ground, the men began shooting at Jimmy, but amazingly, they missed him despite being right in front of him. And Jimmy, who was thinking on his feet, immediately threw himself kind of over the counter and acted like he had been mortally wounded. And so the gunmen, believing Jimmy was down as well, they turned around and they began walking out of the store. But as they were leaving, they noticed Jones Pettis, who was trying to hide at the end of one of the aisles. And so they just fired at him, striking him in the hand and in the stomach. Then the 2 gunmen left, they hopped in a car, and they fled. Paramedics would rush Sarah Abraham and Jones Pettis to the hospital. Jones would survive, but Sarah would die from her injuries 5 days later. When Detective Burke arrived at the convenience store that morning, the other officers who were already on scene told him that Jimmy and Jones had not gotten a good look at the shooters. They just said that they were two young men and that they didn't recognize them. After being told this information, Burke stepped inside of the convenience store to have a look around. He was already operating on the idea that this attack had to be linked to Richmond Maddox and to Danita Gillette, because again, the proximity and time to the other murders was just too much to overlook. That couldn't be a coincidence. And sure enough, right as Burke stepped into the store, this hunch of his seemed to be confirmed, because on the blood-stained ground near the counter were several .25 caliber aluminum shell casings, the same distinctive ammunition type that was used in Danita's murder. At this point, Burke was fully convinced these murders had to be linked. But the victims didn't make sense. It would turn out none of the victims' families had ever heard of the other victims or their families. None of the victims worked together or went to school together or had any interaction at all. It just seemed like the victims were kind of random. But as Burke and his partners were discussing how these crimes could be linked, Burke got yet another call. There had just been an attempted shooting at a Dayton gas station. When Burke arrived, they found this hysterical woman named Kathy Henderson, who earlier had been putting air in the tires of her black 1989 Dodge Shadow. When two young men pull into the parking lot, they hop out of the car and they walk right up to her. They raise their guns at her, and then one of them says, "You're gonna die today." And then the two men just started shooting at her. And amazingly, she managed to not get shot and she was able to run to safety, but the two men stole her car. The bullet casings that were found at the scene of this crime were, unsurprisingly, the same distinctive aluminum variety. Clearly, whoever was behind all of these shootings was not showing any signs of slowing down. And so by now, these shootings in Dayton had attracted so much attention that it was not only all over the local media, but it was all over the national media. This was all anybody in the country was talking about, that there was just these rogue people running around Dayton shooting random people, and the police apparently couldn't stop them. And so panic was spreading like a wave amongst Dayton residents and surrounding areas. It didn't seem to matter who you were or what you were doing. Suddenly, everyone felt like they could be next. On the evening of December 26th, shortly after Kathy Henderson's carjacking was reported, Dayton Police Sergeant John Huber was in his patrol car cruising the northwest neighborhood of Dayton when an all-points bulletin came across his radio. The dispatcher said to be on the lookout for the 1989 Dodge Shadow that Kathy Henderson had stolen, and that if they found it, be advised because the occupants were likely the same people perpetrating all of these shootings all over town, and so they were likely armed and dangerous. Huber had developed a knack for finding stolen cars in Dayton. He knew where all the little cutouts were and back alleys were where people like to stash their stolen cars, and so he decided he would just go looking for the Dodge Shadow. And after only being on the hunt for about 20 minutes, he looked down a dark, quiet street just a mile away from where Danita had been killed, and he saw a black Dodge Shadow parked on the side of the road. When he drove up behind it, he saw it was empty, so he called the police station and asked them to run the license plates. And when they called him back, they told him that the plates did not belong to a black Dodge Shadow. They belonged to a blue Pontiac Grand Am, and that the Grand Am was registered to a 34-year-old man named Joseph Wilkerson. Sergeant Huber was confused and thought maybe he had given them the wrong plates, but then he noticed, parked a little ways down the road ahead of the Dodge Shadow, was a blue Pontiac Grand Am. And so on a hunch, Huber drove forward and he took down the Grand Am's license plates and he called back into the police station and he asked them to run those. And they would come back and they would say, well, it turns out the plates on the Grand Am are the plates that should be on Kathy Henderson's Dodge Shadow. Meaning, clearly, in an effort to cover their trail, the suspects had switched the license plates between these two cars. And so naturally, Sergeant Huber picked up his radio and he asked if Joseph Wilkerson had reported his car as stolen. And after a few moments, the radio crackled back from headquarters that no, Joseph Wilkerson had not reported this car stolen. So Huber immediately became very suspicious of this Joseph Wilkerson person and told headquarters they should really send someone over to Joseph's property to talk to him, since most likely he was either one of the shooters or was involved in some way with all of these shootings. Huber said he would stay put on this road and he would stake out these two vehicles and wait to see if anyone came back to claim them. Detective Burke and his team were the ones dispatched to go check out the Wilkerson property. It was a small single-floor white house that was located only about 2.5 miles from where Danita had been killed. Burke opened the front gate that surrounded the property and he walked along the pathway up onto the front porch and he knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. Burke called out that, hey, it's police, you gotta open up, but there was silence in the house. Burke left the porch and walked around to the back of the house and knocked on the back door, but still no one came to the door. However, as Burke and his team stood around the back of the house, they all started to smell something awful. It was this putrid smell that was definitely coming from inside the house. They didn't know what the smell was, but given the circumstances and frankly the urgency to figure out who is behind all these shootings, they decided this smell constituted potential foul play, and so they kicked in the back door and they made entry into the house. Immediately, the smell picked up tenfold. It smelled absolutely horrible inside this house. And just from a quick glance around the inside, it was very obvious this house had been ransacked. Somebody had robbed this house. All the drawers and cabinets had been opened. There was trash and clothing and random pieces of electronics all over the ground. And so the police, they have their guns out. They're scanning around the room and they're yelling out, "Police, if you're here, show yourself. We're coming in." But no one showed themselves. It was all silent in the house. And so the police began carefully stepping through the house, and they eventually turned right and began walking down this one central hallway that seemed to lead to kind of a back room that looked like maybe a bedroom at the end of the hall. And as they're walking down this hallway, the smell is getting stronger and stronger. And then finally, they get to the end of this hallway and they look into this room and they can see what is causing the smell. There on the bed in this room was 34-year-old Joseph Wilkerson. His wrists and his ankles had been tied to the 4 posters of the bed with electrical wire, kind of putting him in a spread eagle position on his back. He had no clothes on, but he had a pillow over his chest and his head, and on the outside, on the top of the pillow, were 2 obvious scorch marks. Someone had clearly pressed a gun into that pillow and then fired 2 shots through it into Joseph's chest and his head, killing him. And from the look of his body and the smell, Wilkerson had likely been dead for at least several days. Also on the ground was another aluminum shell casing, meaning almost certainly this murder was connected to all the others. But the police still had no clue who their attackers were. Who were these mysterious 2 young men? Who was this young girl who jumped out of that car? Was that Laura Taylor? Was that the ex-girlfriend? Was she kidnapped? They didn't know. None of it made any sense. Who were the victims? They don't know each other. Why are they being chosen? What is the connection? And so because the police were kind of at a dead end and they really didn't know where to take this case, they set up a tip line that night for people in Dayton and outside of Dayton to call in with any information about any of these shooting victims. And over the first couple of hours that this tip line was established, the callers that were calling in were providing nothing of value. But late that night on the 26th, a call came through from an 18-year-old named Nicholas Woodson. And based on the tone of his voice, it was obvious he was genuinely scared for his life. He told police that he thought he was going to be the next Dayton murder victim. When police asked him why, he said, "Because I know who the killers are. There's 4 of them, and I think they're planning to kill me next to keep me from talking to you." While the police spoke with Nicholas, Sergeant Huber was still hiding out in his patrol car, watching the Dodge Shadow and the Pontiac Grand Am from a distance. He was kind of hidden behind some trees, and at some point, he saw movement in an apartment building situated just opposite where these 2 vehicles were parked. 3 young people walked out of the building. They walked down the front steps out onto the road, and as they crossed over the road towards the 2 vehicles, they were illuminated by the streetlight, and Huber could clearly see there were 2 young men and a small young woman. One of the men climbed into the driver's seat of the Dodge Shadow, while the other 2 climbed into the passenger and back seat of the Shadow. As the driver turned the Shadow on and pulled away from the curb, Huber radioed into headquarters that the vehicle was on the move and he needed backup right away, and then he too pulled away from the curb and began following them. After just 2 blocks, the Shadow stopped, And at that moment, Sergeant Huber sped up behind them with his lights on, and immediately the passenger door of the Shadow flew open and one of the two men took off running. But the other man and the woman stayed in the vehicle. Huber's backup had not arrived yet, so he couldn't worry about the runner. Instead, he stepped out of his car and stood behind his open car door to kind of use it as a shield, and he aimed his pistol at the driver and he yelled for them not to move. Inside the Dodge, the interior light was now on, and it showed the man was still sitting in the driver's seat, not really doing anything, and the young woman who was in the car, who was in the back seat, she was becoming hysterical, and she was screaming at the driver to shoot him now, shoot him now. But the driver didn't do anything. And then moments later, backup arrived, and they were able to pull the man and the woman out of the Dodge without a fight, and they arrested them both. They were 19-year-old Marvallis Keene, and the young woman was none other than 16-year-old Laura Taylor, the ex-girlfriend of Richmond Maddox, whose family had reported her missing. The police searched the nearby buildings for the man who had run, and they quickly found him. He had gone back inside the apartment building that Sergeant Huber had originally seen the trio come out of before they got into the Dodge Shadow. The runner was 17-year-old DeMarcus Smith, and with him in the building he was attempting to hide inside of was 20-year-old Heather Matthews, and she was actively trying to hide DeMarcus. And so both of them were arrested as well. When all four of them were brought back to the station, the police noticed that Marvallis was wearing Danita's flannel jacket and DeMarcus was wearing Danita's sneakers. Additionally, while these four were being processed at the police station, a call came in from a team of police investigators who were searching the Dodge Shadow, and they would say that they recovered two guns, a .32 caliber Derringer pistol and a .25 caliber pistol that contained the same distinctive aluminum ammunition that was used in almost all of the murders. The police had just caught their killers, and they would soon find out they had done a lot more damage than the public was aware of. The police would interrogate all four of them that night, starting with Laura Taylor, who they thought would be the easiest to get information from because she was 16, so she was the youngest, and she was considered to be very kind and thoughtful. But Laura would remain silent for the entire long interrogation, and when she was asked at some point if she wanted to take a break to go use the restroom, she just stood up and urinated directly onto the floor and then sat back down again in silence. But Laura was the only one who acted tough. The other three talked, and before long, the police heard the whole awful story of what they had done. It all started back on the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve. Laura, Heather, and Marvallis were sitting around together talking about how they needed money. And at some point, Laura suggested they rob a guy she knew, Joseph Wilkerson. She said he probably had lots of nice things in his house, and I know he has a car, so we can take all of that. The other two liked the idea, and so Laura called Joseph and asked him if he wanted to be a part of an orgy with them, and Joseph said yes. So the trio walked over to Joseph's house, he let them in, and then the two girls and Joseph walked back into that back bedroom while Marvallis sat on the couch in the living room. In the bedroom, Joseph laid on the bed and he took his clothes off, and Heather and Laura pretended to start taking their clothes off when suddenly Marvallis, as planned, came bursting into the room with his pistol held out in front of him. He aimed it at Joseph and told him not to move, and then he ordered Heather and Laura to tie Joseph's hands and ankles to the four posters of the bed. Joseph immediately begins to beg for his life and tells them they can take anything they want in the house. Anything in this house, it's yours, just please don't shoot me. Marvallis instructed the girls to go search his house for valuables. And so while Marvallis is standing there with the gun aimed at Joseph, Joseph, perhaps in an attempt to kind of bargain his way out of this, says to Marvallis, hey, I have a really amazing gun, a .32 caliber Derringer that I have hidden in the garage. If you want it, I can tell you where it is. And so Marvallis was totally interested, and he said, yeah, tell me where it is. And so Joseph explained where to go in the garage, and so Marvallis left the room, he went into the garage, and he would eventually find this little gun, this .32 caliber gun. And then when Marvallis walked back into the bedroom with Joseph, he promptly walked over to Joseph, grabbed a pillow, he put it over Joseph's chest. Joseph is just looking up at him, wondering what he's doing. And then Marvallis took this new gun, this .32 caliber Derringer, and he pushed it into the pillow, so it was aiming straight down at Joseph's body. Joseph pleaded with him not to shoot him, but Mrballen pulled the trigger and he fired a shot through the pillow into Joseph's chest. Joseph began screaming, and then he made this guttural sound and his whole body began to shake. And so the other two girls, they heard the sound of the shot, so they came running back into the bedroom. And when they saw what was happening, they just stood there. And then Laura looked over at Mrballen and said, "Hey, can I shoot him too?" And Mrballen says, "Sure." And he hands her the .32 caliber Derringer, the one they had taken from the garage. And Laura takes the gun. She walks over to the still shaking Wilkerson. She repositions the pillow on his face. She pushes the Derringer into the pillow, aiming right at Joseph's face. And then she pulls the trigger, but it doesn't fire. And so frustrated, she turns away from Wilkerson, who's still making all sorts of noise. He's still shaking. And she walks over to Mrballen and says, "Let me use your gun." And so Mrballen pulls out a .25 caliber gun. It was his gun. It was the gun that used aluminum shell casing rounds. And he hands it to Laura. And so Laura hands him the Derringer. She takes the .25 caliber. And then she walks right next to Joseph again. She grabs the pillow and makes sure it's flush to his face. She puts the .25 caliber gun up against the pillow, aiming it right at Joseph's face, and then she pulls the trigger. This time the gun would fire, and as soon as it did, Joseph's body stopped shaking and he went limp. As the trio stood there staring at Joseph Wilkerson's lifeless body, they all realized something. Killing was actually quite fun. The trio left the bedroom and began eating Wilkerson's food and watching his TV and looking for things to steal, all the while happily talking about how amazing the killing experience had just been. Eventually, though, their killing high had worn off, and they realized that Wilkerson did not have any cash in the house, and really, he didn't have nice stuff in his house, so they couldn't really even sell very much of it for very much money. And so they decided they needed to go rob somebody else to get the money they needed. But first, they recruited another friend of theirs, DeMarcus Smith, to come over and join them. When DeMarcus arrived, he, along with Laura and Mrballen, left Wilkerson's house, leaving Heather behind to watch over the place. The trio walked away from the house towards town, keeping an eye out for anyone who was out alone and could potentially be an easy target to mug. And eventually, around 10 p.m., they spotted a young woman they didn't know standing near a payphone. It was Danita, and she was fishing coins out of her pocket to put into the phone. By the time Danita had finished dialing the number of her mother's house, she heard the sound of Mrballen and DeMarcus come running up behind her, and when she turned around, she saw they had guns pointing at her, so she dropped the phone. Then the two men demanded she give them her shoes, which she instantly did, but then, simply because he thought it would be fun, Mrballen still just started shooting her. So he shot Danita 4 times, and then DeMarcus, who had not been a part of the Wilkerson killing, just immediately joined in, and he shot her a 5th time. After she was laying on the ground, dead or dying, the two men yanked her plaid jacket and her backpack off, and then they ran back to Laura on the other side of the road, and the trio retreated back to the Wilkerson house. When Danita's sister, Rhonda, picked up that phone call around 10 p.m. and was met with silence, that really had been her sister Danita calling, but Danita had died literally seconds before the line had connected. Even though, once again, their robbery target did not yield them very much in terms of monetary value, the friends felt like this second murder was still a really good thing. It was a turning point for them. They felt invincible. Killing was the best high that any of them had ever experienced. So in some ways, it didn't matter that they weren't making any money out of these robberies. It was the killing part they liked. To celebrate their murders, the 4 friends threw a party that night at Wilkerson's house. So Wilkerson's dead body is just literally decomposing in the bedroom. They just shut the door during this party. One of the people who showed up to this party was Jeffrey Wright, one of Heather's former boyfriends. And at some point in the night, Heather and Jeffrey got into this huge argument, and Jeffrey grabbed Heather by the hair and started dragging her into a back room. And so, drawn by the commotion of this, Mrballen burst into the room after them and chased Jeffrey, who leapt out of a window. Mrballen jumped out of the window after him and then began shooting at him, hitting Jeffrey 4 times in the legs as he ran away. Miraculously, Jeffrey would make it to a hospital and he would survive, though he would not go to police and tell them what happened. Seeing Heather's ex-boyfriend get shot excited Laura, and she decided she wanted to shoot her ex-boyfriend too. So the next day, on Christmas, Laura called up Richmond Maddox and asked him if he wanted to have sex with her at a nearby motel. When he said yes, she told him he would have to pay for the motel, so bring cash. Richmond agreed, and when he arrived at the designated meeting place that day, Laura climbed into the front passenger seat next to him, knowing full well she was going to kill him and steal the money out of his wallet first chance she got. But after they took off, Richmond looked in his rearview mirror and he saw Mrballen and DeMarcus following them in a car. Sensing this was a setup, Richmond hit the gas, and without any hesitation, Laura pulled out the .32 caliber Derringer pistol they had stolen from Wilkerson. She placed it against Richmond's right temple and she fired. Then she threw herself out of the moving car right before it crashed into the tree. Mrballen and DeMarcus would swing by and pick her up a little ways down the road, and then the trio would head back to their base of operations, the Wilkerson house. At this point, the foursome had killed 3 people and nearly killed a 4th. But while they were very pleased with this, they still hadn't managed to take anything of real value from any of their victims, and realistically, even though the killing was fun, they did need cash. They had no money. So the next morning, on December 26th, Laura, Mrballen, DeMarcus, and Heather decided they would rob a convenience store. So they pulled up in front of Sarah Abraham's store, and while Heather, DeMarcus, and Mrballen waited outside in the car, Laura went in to scope the place out. After going inside and counting how many people were in there, although she counted wrong, she walked up to the counter to buy gum, but she was a nickel short. However, 71-year-old Jimmy Thompson gave her the nickel she needed, and so she bought the gum, she smiled, and she made her way out. When she walked back outside, she hopped into the car, and she told DeMarcus and Mrballen that it was just 2 people inside, the cashier and the man who had given her a nickel. She had not seen Jones Pettis, who was at the end of one of the aisles. So DeMarcus and Mrballen go inside the shop, and they hold Sarah and Jimmy at gunpoint, and after getting all the cash out of the cash register, which was only $40, the urge to kill became too much for Mrballen to control. And so he raised his gun, he aimed it at Sarah, and he shot her in the face. DeMarcus would attempt to shoot Jimmy, but he would miss. And then the pair, on their way out, would notice Jones at the end of the aisle. And even though he posed absolutely no threat to them, they shot at him anyways. After Heather drove them away from the convenience store, they stopped at a gas station for reasons we don't really know, at which point DeMarcus and Mrballen, they see this woman, Kathy Henderson, who's just completely minding her own business. She's putting air in her Dodge Shadow's tires, and they decide they're going to kill her too. So they hop out of the car, they walk over to her, and Mrballen literally says to her, "You're going to die today," and then he raises his gun and he begins shooting at her, as does DeMarcus. But amazingly, they miss her, and so she gets away. She does not get shot. And then they just steal her car. Even though by now the foursome had left behind an astounding amount of evidence that 100% was going to get them caught eventually. Despite that, their only fear at this time was that 2 of their friends, 18-year-old Marvin Washington and 16-year-old Wendy Cottrill, might snitch and turn them in. Marvin and Wendy had been present at that big party at the Wilkerson's house and had overheard the foursome talking about the murders, and the foursome knew they had overheard. But strangely, Wendy and Marvin were not the only people at that party who had overheard them. 18-year-old Nicholas Woodson was also at this party, and he overheard, and they knew he overheard. But for some reason, the foursome had identified Marvin and Wendy as the most likely to snitch. And so Mrballen confronted the pair about this, and he told them they would have to come along for the next murder to prove their loyalty and trustworthiness. And Wendy and Marvin agreed. And so that night, on December 26th, Mrballen and DeMarcus drove Marvin and Wendy out to the edge of town to this gravel pit. And when they got there and parked the car, Wendy and Marvin realized they were the next murder victims. They pleaded with Mrballen to let them go, that they wouldn't say anything, they promised, but he wasn't having it. Marvin eventually got out of the car and DeMarcus followed, and DeMarcus told Marvin to get on his knees, which he did, and then DeMarcus shot him in the back of the head, execution style. And so Wendy has seen this happen, so she knows she's next, and she begins screaming and begging for her life, and she grabs onto the inside of the car so as not to get pulled out. but DeMarcus comes back over to the car. He grabs her and starts pulling on her, and then Mrballen as well comes around and he grabs onto her too. And between the two of them, they're able to pull Wendy out of the car, at which point Mrballen told her to open her mouth. And eventually she would, and Mrballen put the pistol, the .25 caliber pistol, into her mouth, and he told her to bite the barrel. And then when she was biting the barrel, he pulled the trigger. The killers left the bodies where they fell and just hopped back in their car and headed back into town. Nicholas Woodson likely knew that Marvin and Wendy had just been killed for snitching. And so he's thinking to himself, I overheard them talking about the murders. What's stopping Mrballen and DeMarcus from killing me next? I know about the murders, and they know that. And so that was the point at which Nicholas would call the tip line, and he would say, I know who the killers are. It's these 4 people. And literally, practically at the exact same time that Nicholas was giving this tip, Sergeant Huber had spotted Mrballen and DeMarcus and Laura getting into the Dodge Shadow, which would lead to their arrest as well as Heather Matthews' arrest. After going to trial a year later, Laura Taylor, Heather Matthews, and DeMarcus Smith would all receive life sentences. As for Marvellus Keene, who was effectively the ringleader of the foursome, he would be sentenced to death. His execution was carried out on July 21st, 2009. He died by lethal injection. Thank you for listening to the Mrballen podcast. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask to borrow the 5-star review button's phone to make a quick call, but instead log on to their Facebook and change their relationship status from married to it's complicated. Also, please subscribe to the Mrballen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, please send